So without further ado, I want to introduce Tina Gao. So Tina is an engineer who actually works on the Angular material team. The Angular material folks are the ones that are producing the component library that takes Google's material design philosophy and manifests it for the world as a set of kind of usable components. And then recently they've been extending that into what they call the CDK, or the component dev kit, which allows you to not only take our UI vision, but then also, if you don't want to use our UI vision, you can take advantage of all of the underlying behaviors, all the underlying properties to build out your own component library. So that's a very cool thing that a lot of developers have really liked. So without further ado, Tina.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tina Gao. I'm a software engineer working on Angular material at Google. Today, I'd like to introduce the tree component I built for our Angular material library. A little bit more about me. I like taking photos of the nature. So I like skies, stars, and trees. Maybe that's why I built the tree component. So what are trees? We see trees every day, like in our file system in our project, or in Google Drive. When we select a folder, we can expand the folder to see what's inside it. So tree is a parent-child hierarchy. And I'm introducing the tree components for visually represent these trees of data. We have a material design version in our Angular material that follows material design specs. But if you don't like material design and you have your own specs, you can use the installed version in Angular CDK. So I will go through the concept of the trees in Angular material and show you some demos. And lastly, I will show you how to build a tree. Now let's see the concepts. We have two types of trees in Angular material. One is flat tree, and the other one is nested tree. In flat tree, the logical parent-child relationship is flattened, and now they become siblings in the DOM. For nested tree, we preserve the parent-child relationship in the DOM. So for a tree node, its children are nested inside the parent's DOM. We build two types of trees because we believe different users have different needs for these two types of trees. So these are two implementations we decided to go. And I will explain the differences between these two. Both types have some pros and cons. The flat tree, because an ancestor and all the descendants become siblings in the DOM. And the DOM element can be easily reused. So it's simpler to add virtual scrolling to the flat tree. It's also good at handling large amount of data. However, it needs a flattener to transform the nested structure to flattened structure. So it takes more steps to set up. For the nested tree, because it's preserved the parent-child relationship in the DOM, so it's easier to decorate as a tree to show this relationship. And it doesn't need a flattener, so it's easier to set up compared to the flat tree. However, because the DOM structure is nested, so it's hard to add virtual scrolling to the nested tree. And you may wonder, which one should I use? I'd say flat tree is the default choice, and it's good for a large amount of data. It also has good performance. And the nested tree is easier to set up, so it's easier for small trees and for some demos. It's also good for nested decoration if you have special need to decorate the tree in a nested way. It's maybe harder to do it in flat tree. Now let me show you some demos. We have 4 demos here. And the first one is a flat tree. So we have a list of nodes, and user can click or tap on the toggle to expand the tree nodes. And we can also make this toggle recursive. So when we click on a tree node, all the descendants are expanded. We can also make it non-recursive. So it only expands one level at a time. So in this tree, we define each node like this. This is an example. You can define your tree node in different ways. Here, a node is a game or is a category of game, and we have an item name. A node can also have a list of children. And that's the data for the tree I showed you. Here, some nodes are nested of other nodes. The next one I'd like to show you is nested tree. It uses the same data structure and data as the flat tree. And it has the same function. Like when the user click on the tree node, it will expand and collapse. It can also be non-recursive. So it can expand the tree node level by level. And here in nested tree, we show some dotted line between parent and children. And this is done by HTML and CSS. It's easier to decorate the tree with this dotted line to show the relationship. In a flat tree, if you want to do this, you need to store extra data for each node. The next example I want to show you is a checklist. So we can put some checkbox inside each tree node and make the parent checkbox selected if all the descendants are selected. So here's the example of checklist. And when we click on checkbox of the parent, all the children are selected. And we can also select a child to make the parents partially selected. The next example I'd like to show you is a dynamic loaded tree. Here, after I click on the toggle of a node, a progress bar will display. And the children of the current node will be fetched from database and displayed after the fetch is done. And for dynamic loaded tree, we need to change the data source, which I will introduce later. So when the node is toggled, we set its loading to true to show the progress bar. And then we fetch the children from database. And after we got the children, we feed the new data to the tree and hide the progress bar. Okay. Now let's see how we can build a tree. there are three major things we need. The first one is a data source, which is how we feed the data to the tree. And the second one is the tree control, which handles all the expansion collapsing of tree node. And the third one is the template. That's how we'd like to display the tree. We can pass a data source to the tree in the template like this. And there are three data source options. It can be a data array, or it can be an observable of data array. Or it can be a data source with connect and disconnect method. The connect method returns an observable of data array. If you have used the data table in Angular CDK or Angular material, you will be familiar with this type of data source. And each item in the array represents one node in the tree. It can be nested, but for a flat tree, the nested structure needs to be flattened before it can fit to the tree. We also made some pre-built data source, one for flat tree and one for nested tree. You can also use your own data source. Now let's see the tree control. It handles all the expansion collapse of toggles, and it also tracks the status of all the tree nodes. We can set the tree node to mat tree in the template. We have two types of tree controls, one for flat tree and the other one for nested tree. And for flat tree control, we need to pass in two functions. The first one tells you the level of current node, and the other one tells you whether the node is expandable or not. For nested tree control, we need one function to get the children of the current node. Now let's see the templates. I will talk about the tree node, node depth, toggle, and padding. We can define a tree node by mat tree node for flat tree and mat nested tree node for nested tree. Note for nested tree, we also need a mat tree node outlet. That's the position we rendered all the children of current node. And we define the node template in node depth. We also pass the context for the current node in this node depth. And later, as in the example, we can use the content of the context. For example, node.item or node.value. In a tree, we can also define different kind of tree node template. We can have multiple templates. In this example, there are two types of tree nodes. One is input, one is select. And when the node is input node, the first function returns true. So the first template will be used by the tree to render the current node. If the type is select, then the second function returns true. The second template will be used to render the current node. And we also need a default template to render when none of the functions returns true. The toggle of the node is to expand or collapse a node. And this directive can be put anywhere in the tree node template. It can be triggered by user's click or tap events. In the example, we can put it on a mat tree node, or we can put on a button inside the node template. You can also put multiple toggles if you need. And we can change whether the toggle is recursive or not by mat tree node toggle recursive. And if it's recursive, toggle node will also toggle all the descendants. We also have padding for flat tree. Because in flat tree, all the nodes are siblings in the DOM, so we need a way to show the hierarchy of the tree. That's why we add paddings to the mat tree node. So we need the level information to render this padding. And for mat tree, our default padding for each level is 40 pixels. You can change the padding to other values like 20 pixels. Okay, that's how we build a tree. We have some future plans. One is at virtual scaling. In the CDK, once we have that virtual scaling, we will make sure it works with flat tree. And we also plan to build a simple tree example with keyboard navigation, so it has better accessibility. And we also want to build a tree which accepts JSON object, so it can just pass in a JSON object and the tree will render. If you want to know more about the trees, you can go to our GitHub and check the tree docs. You can also get the link of these slides in this URL. So that's all I'd like to talk about the trees.
All right, so while we try and get the technology to work, I'm going to tell a story about David East. So one of the first times I met David East in person was actually at NG Vegas back in 2015, almost 3 years ago.
This is true.
This is true. And so I'm sitting there. I was a GDE at the time. I didn't work for Google. He was the big Googler that we all kind of like say ooh and ah about, because it's David East, right? You still do that today. But I sat down. I'm like, what's up with Angular, right? Like TypeScript, AtScript, what is all this stuff? And he sat me down, and over the next like half an hour, he explained it all to me in a way that made sense. And I was like, oh, why didn't someone just say it like that? And so I always, whenever I'm giving presentations, try and think, why didn't I just say it like David East says it? So
how am I supposed to like give anything good after that? Now everyone's like, all right, perfectly explained.
Expectations are way up here now.
Let's bring them down here. All right.
And I apologize to everyone on the live stream. I'm aware it is cropped, but I'm not aware of what we can do about it.
So thank you all for coming out tonight. Tonight's talk is, I heard some background music. I was going to give a talk to some theme song. That'd be always been a dream of mine. Have some like metal music, like some 80s metal in the background. But my talk tonight is about AngularFire and sort of creating an NgRx experience without the reducers. So my name is David East, as Steven said, and I'm a developer advocate here at Google on the Firebase team. And I really love being a developer advocate. When I first learned about the job, I was like, this is awesome. I want to do that. Like, I want to go to conferences. I want to record videos, do open source libraries. So when I got the job, it was really awesome, like living my dream. But as much as I love it, it's not always like really comfortable for me to explain it to people in like the real world. Like I'll be at a party meeting someone new and they'll tell me what they do for a living. And I'll be like, oh, what's that? You're a veterinarian and you save the lives of puppies every day? That's really cool. And then the awkward part happens. They ask me what I do for a living. And I'm like, okay, I work at Google. And for like a really short amount of time, they get excited. And they're like, oh, wow, what do you do? Do you work on the search team? Do you draw the maps for Google Maps? They're like, what do you do? And I'm like, I make YouTube videos. And then at that point, it's just like, it's over. They look at me with someone who, like, this person does not have real problems. And you know what? I do have problems, you know? Like, I may not save puppies' lives or, you know, draw Google Maps, but I do have problems. So I get asked questions pretty much every day, like all the time. I get sent stuff on Twitter, there's GitHub issues, Stack Overflow questions, YouTube comments, pretty much any medium that I'm on, I wake up and there's just a whole set of questions. Now, the questions aren't my problem. I actually really like answering people's questions. My problem is that I actually don't know most of the answers to the questions people ask me. So someone will ping me and be like, hey, David, do you know how to use the expand operator with an AngularFire collection? And I'm like, no. Or they'll be like, hey, do you know why my observable has all these subscriptions to it? And I'm like, no. So what I do is I actually look at the information they give me and I go to Google and I type that in and then I tell them what I found on Google, and that tends to work. But sometimes I get questions that aren't just so easy to answer from Google. You know, sometimes I have to do a lot of research and a lot of pondering. And sometimes they kind of catch you off guard because you think they're really easy and they tend up being very difficult. So a while back, someone came up to me and was like, hey, how do I use AngularFire with NgRx? And I saw this and I was like, easy one. I'm going to nail this one. I helped like co-create AngularFire, and I also built NgRx or helped build NgRx into a production app at Google. I'm going to know how to do this one. And so I start trying to answer it, and I keep running into these problems, and I can't get an answer that I really like. So it kind of like surprised me. And NgRx is this really simple pattern. You select state from a store, and that gives you back your data as an observable. Now, you can't modify this data directly because you have to be able to, you know, not asynchronously, but you have to follow this unidirectional pattern. So instead of directly modifying it, you dispatch an action. Say, I want to add a new item to this array. That triggers a reducer method where at this point you can say, all right, we're going to put a new item onto this array, and that emits a new state from your selector. It's like really simple. But the thing is with NgRx, if you don't think through what you're doing, you're going to have some problems. And this is a lot of mental boilerplate because we have actions, we have reducers, we have the store structure. It's like all very paralyzing to think about when you're building your app. And you might start off being like, oh, I have an added action, a deleted action, a modified action, a toggle action, an undo action, an add all action, some very specific action that I need just for my app. And that's actually not the hard part. Actions are cheap. It's getting to the reducer is the difficult part. This is where you got to do the real stuff. You got to transform your state, and you get all these case statements where you're added, removed, deleted, updated. It just gets to the point where you're like, if I have to create another reducer, like I don't know what to do. I got to change my whole store, like my whole store structure. So when I was answering this question of how to use AngularFire with NgRx, I didn't want to just keep adding to this mental boilerplate. I didn't want to give people more concepts, more things to do. And I even went to Rob Wormald, there in the back, you know, developer advocate at Google, one of the co-creators of NgRx. And I asked him, like, hey, you know, surely I am maintaining AngularFire, you maintain NgRx, so we can come up with a solution here. And we talked, we had multiple meetings about it. We never really came up with anything. We never quite came up with a way of plugging these two pieces together. And this actually reminded me of something from my childhood. See, my father is like a math pro, but math is not hereditary. And I was not a math pro. I pretty much used to go to my father every day with math homework and be like, Dad, please help me solve this problem. And my dad would, most of the time help me. But one time I remember he gave me a piece of advice that was a lot more helpful than just an answer. He said to me, instead of trying to memorize how to plug the pieces together, you need to learn the underlying concepts. And then you'll be able to solve any problem. So back then, I was like, okay, Dad, whatever, just help me solve for X here. Really got to get this homework done. But now it's been like 15, 20 years later. I think, it's starting to sink in. So today I really want to go and kind of look at the concepts behind AngularFire and NgRx. And at this point, I think we can solve this problem. So who here has ever used Firebase before? Just trying to gauge the audience. All right, it's a good amount of hands. Mostly people I know, but it's still a good amount of hands. So for those who don't know, Firebase is a platform for building. And you might ask yourself, building what? Well, just really awesome stuff. So if you head over to firebase.google.com, you get tons of information all about what Firebase is about. But it's really a set of infrastructure for your app. So when you need to do something, there's usually a Firebase service for that. You want easy to set up, blazing fast web hosting? Well, there's Firebase hosting. You want serverless compute to do things like send email notifications or make payments? Well, Cloud Functions will handle that. If you want to set up push notifications or send and receive them across all platforms, web, Android, iOS, there's Firebase Cloud Messaging. If you need to store and synchronize data across devices in real time, there's AngularFire Store. For logging in your users across all these different devices with multiple login providers without writing a single line of server code, Firebase Authentication. And for managing binary files like video, images, and all sorts of files, there's Firebase Storage. So one of my main things as a developer advocate is making the AngularFire library. And as you probably have guessed by now, AngularFire is the official integration of Angular and Firebase. And pretty much what we do is we take a lot of these promise-based or callback-based APIs, and we just pipe them into observable so it fits really nicely with our Angular flow. And so what we have is we have modules for most of the Firebase features that I mentioned. So for authentication, we have AngularFire Auth. For storage, we have AngularFire Storage. We're working on an AngularFire Messaging and an AngularFire Functions module. And we also have AngularFire Store, which is the one that I really want to talk about today. So when people say, I want to use AngularFire with NgRx, they're really abbreviating it down to, I want to use AngularFire Store with NgRx. And so this is the wrapper module we have around the CloudFire Store database. So CloudFire Store is a cloud database, it's NoSQL, it's like super scalable, and it's a little different than most of the databases that you might have used. It's more than just pulling data in and trying to pull data out. The way it works is that every time one piece of data is updated, it synchronizes those changes across all connected devices. So I got a yellow line going in, and I got all these blue lines going down. One person makes an update, all the clients receive the synchronized state. So I add an item to the array, all the other blue lines send down that array, so everyone has the same exact array across all clients. So what this is, it's state management for remote data. So I can just make a change and I can know that's going to be synchronized across all my devices. And the way it works is you inject your AngularFire Store service, and then in your on init, you create a reference. So everything is with collections and documents, so like a lot of NoSQL databases you've used before. And so in this case, I'm saying, go to my collection list of items. And now that I have this reference, give me an observable stream of my items. And I can do that with this value changes method. Now, much like NgRx, you can't directly modify this. We have to actually dispatch some type of event. And to do that, we could create a delete method that takes in an item. We take that reference and we grab a single child reference to its document, pass in its ID, and then we can just delete it. And what that will do is it'll dispatch an event to the CloudFire Store servers, which will then synchronize that change, and then that item removes from all the other connected devices. So looking at this API, you're like, I don't know why you have such a problem, David. why don't you just dispatch these state changes you're getting to the NgRx store? And the way this would look like is you would use both AngularFire store and the NgRx store. And then in ng-on-init, you create your reference. And then now we're going to subscribe to the value changes observable. But rather than bind that to our view, we're just going to dispatch it to the store. We'll give it a type of like item sync, and then the payload is the new state. Like problem solved, right? That's all you have to do. We store it and we're done. And this was the first idea I had too. But I eventually learned that there's some problems with this. First off, this is very redundant. We're saying, hey, dispatch these items that were synced. Why do we have to dispatch them? We already have them. They're already synchronized. So we're duplicating the work to send them somewhere else when we already have them ready to use in our view. And then this value changes method, this is a synchronized array. This has already been reduced for us. So we're going to dispatch some state to a reducer so it's in the store, but it's already been reduced. So this is completely redundant. And also, this is a little minor, but at this point, we have to manage the subscription, and you can listen to it in ng on destroy. But this is a lot of work for one component to be handling. And what this all does is just adds to this mental boilerplate. I have my data, but I can't just use it. I have to then dispatch it, and then I have to write a reducer for that. And this is how people get into this mess. So this is not really a solution that I was looking for. And so the problem is that AngularFire Store and NgRx Store, they really handle state management. So there's a lot of redundancies between the two. They both want to do the same thing. So we're kind of trying to keep them both in sync. And it's just a lot of duplication of our work. And this is a little small, but it's the best I could do to get them side by side. So if you squint, and I can't zoom because I don't know what's up with this page, but if you squint really hard, the way this works is to the left, we have AngularFire Store, and to the right, we have the NgRx Store. And these APIs are actually really, really similar when we look at them. To the left, we're creating a reference and then selecting our observable of items. To the right with NgRx Store, we are just using the select statement from the store to get back our items. So it looks almost the same. And then to delete, we don't directly modify it. We dispatch events. With AngularFire Store, we call a delete method that triggers something on the server that synchronizes the changes. And then with NgRx, we dispatch an item deleted event, and then this will run it through a reducer and remove the item. And when you look at them next to each other, it made me realize that AngularFire Store is really just Redux in disguise. We have a different API, but we're basically doing Redux. So rather than having a different API, imagine if we had something like a store for AngularFire, and we could just select a collection from the store of items, and this returns us back our observable of items, just kind of like the NgRx Store does. And then if we wanted to make any changes, we just run a dispatch statement, just like on the store. And this isn't pseudocode, actually. This is something that I wrote, a library called AngularFire Redux. And you can go through and install it today and start doing Reduxy things. And so the thing to really see here is that we've kind of removed a lot of this mental boilerplate. We have all the ergonomics of NgRx, but it's just backed by AngularFire Store. It's basically the same concepts, but with a more Redux-friendly API. I run a select statement, I dispatch events. But what's awesome here is that my actions, I don't have to think of them. I don't have to create them. They're all baked in. I have a special property here called path because we have to know what part of the database we're updating. But then after that, you just say the type, and we have a deleted action, which the library will know to run a delete method, and then the payload of the item. And so we don't have to create these actions. They're baked in for us. And then also with the select statement, we're not creating a reducer. Every single time an item changes, it's just going to spit out the synchronized state. So it's one less piece of my app I have to write. So there's no reducers, and we get to use baked-in actions. So that's it. We solved it. I'm done, right? You know, like to use AngularFire with NgRx, you just don't use NgRx, right? That's all you have to do. But it's actually not that easy, because what about local state? Because AngularFire Store, it synchronizes your remote state. It has to run through a server. And when we're creating our applications, especially for NgRx, you provide this interface of your app state. And it usually has two types of state to it. You have this remote state, and this is data that lives on a server somewhere, and you usually download it and dispatch it to the store. And then we have this local state, like whether the menu is visible or what the theme color is. And this is something that probably will never live on a server, but it happens through user-triggered events. And so this is where I realized, all right, well, what if we took AngularFire Store and we took NgRx Store and we gave them just one responsibility? AngularFire Store is responsible for remote state. NgRx Store is only responsible for a local state. And when you have local and remote state, that is your entire application state. We can think of them as two separate things that makes up the one whole. So rather than having just this whole app state together like this, we can, rather than using this interface with the NgRx Store, we can get rid of this remote state. And now we have a new interface of local state, which is just whether the menu is visible. And it doesn't really care about the items. And combining these two together is actually really, really simple. We can select our menu visibility and get that stream back from the NgRx Store. And then with the AngularFire Redux Store, we can just select the column of our remote state. And then now we have these two pieces. We'll create a little like view model observable, use combine latest, combine these two observables together, and then using the nifty little projection function, we just merge them into one object. And that's it. With the store selector, that's our local state. The items selector, that's our remote state. Put them together, and it forms our application state. And that's what our view sees. But it didn't have to know how we got there. So when someone asks you, how do I use AngularFire with NgRx? You just tell them that it's not about duplicating responsibility. We want that sentence didn't end up right. We want to create reducers. We don't want to create reducers for storing remote state. And we want to use baked in actions to dispatch remote state. So we don't want to go and create our own actions. We want to use what's there given to us by AngularFire Store. And for the NgRx Store, we can use that for all of our local states. So if you want to give this library a try, it's up on GitHub. Should probably had put a real link, but if you had this slide and could click on it, it would take you there. So that is all for today. Thank you all so much for coming out, and we'll do the Q&A later. Thank you.
All right. Up next, we have our last speaker of the night. We have Jared Pochtar. He is one of the co-founders at PageDraw, and he's going to be telling us all about using visual design languages to build real working code and lots of more awesome things like that. So let's get you set up, and then we can make the technology work, and then we will start the presentation. So the one warning with this one is that I think a lot of the code that we're going to be taking a look at tonight is basically a sneak preview of something coming. I think it's so bleeding edge that he hasn't even had a chance to check it into source control yet.
Might be true. might be a little bit true.
But I'm really actually excited about this. So I first met Jared 4 months ago, something like that. They're trying to do something very unique and very kind of interesting in terms of changing the way that we think about building web applications from the perspective of what is the work I should be doing and what's the right tool for each of those jobs. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jared.
Thanks, Steven. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. So I have a background doing full stack engineering, just like I think most of you. And tell me if this sounds familiar. you're working on a feature, it involves some interesting algorithms or data flow or whatever it is, syncing to a server, some backend things. And a designer comes over and just taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, I added some drop shadow on that toolbar in this mockup. Can you just like make the thing look like the mockup? So I had that happen to me enough times that I started wondering, why am I as a developer in the middle of the process from designer to production, right? If there's a design change, the designer should be able to make that change in their drawing app and get that into production as fast as possible. By having me in the middle, I have to go write some CSS or some HTML. I have to think about how to vertically center things in HTML, all this stuff that we just take for granted because we've had to do it forever. But it doesn't have to be this way. If you look at some other platforms, like if you look at, there's Android Studio, there's a visual builder for UIs. Even if you look across the aisle to iOS, there's a visual builder. So basically, I just asked the question, why don't we have the same thing for web? And it took a lot of effort, and there's a lot of little reasons here and there why it's pretty tricky, but that's what we built. And that's what I want to show you today that I'm really excited to show for the first time. So like Steven said, this is very experimental. We're going to release a preview version on Monday, and you'll be able to try it out. But for now, I'm just going to show you some of the code we generate. So can you guys see the screens online? Do I have to? All right. Cool. All right. So this is the page draw UI. Looks pretty small. I'm actually going to change my display settings. Sorry, technology. No? Present? There we go. It's a little better. Cool. Okay, so this is page draw. It's a GUI user interface for making other GUI user interfaces. It's a free-form design tool. So this is the most important thing, is that I can pick up, let's say, this little text down here, just some title text, and move it around, totally free-form. There's no reason why I have to move it inside something else, or just, just so. I can just pick up things, drag them wherever I want, draw new rectangles, copy those rectangles, move them around, change colors, all the usual things you'd expect a design tool to do. If you're working with a designer who likes to use Sketch or Figma or other things like that, this should be immediately familiar, both to you and to them. What's different about page draw is that not only do I have this GUI, but I also have this CLI here running in the background, that on every change I make to this design, I get a corresponding change in my live app. So right here, I'm going to just take this, I'm going to move it over here, and I'm going to change the color, and we're going to see another change happen. So let's make that a nice little green color, like green. And you see here, we've automatically updated the real app. This is running on my localhost machine. It's just like any other thing. And the reason why that works is because we're just generating code. So this design right here is getting synced via this CLI into my code base. This is to-do app. So we're going to have a corresponding to-do app component. It's going to be in src/page-draw/to-do app. And here we have, just like any other Angular component, we've got a component.ts, a component.html, and a component.css. So the component.ts is really simple. It's just meant to be passing through data to the component.html. And this is, I think, the really interesting thing. This is all the code that I would have written by hand for that design. It's exactly the same flexbox that I write by hand. There's no position absolute. There's no extra dependencies you have to add that would increase your bundle size and your load time. There's no extra JavaScript-based layout libraries that you'd have to interface with in some kind of janky way. It's literally just the code that I'd have written by hand if you had, paid me to be another front-end developer on your team. As a front-end developer, as a full-stack engineer, I'm so glad to not have to write that code, because now I get to focus on, the AngularFire talk sound really cool. I get to do that all day. This is still pretty experimental. You can see some of the extra variable names and so forth are a little bit long. The class names, we're working on that, because what we get to do differently than what everyone else has done in the past is that we're a compiler. And so the way that we look at the world is you're really taking these images, which are designs. They're not code, they're just designs. And we're compiling them into code, which is something that can be resizing as the screen resizes, reflowing as the data resizes, all of that kind of stuff. We get to take that out of your hands so you don't have to worry about it anymore. So in a page draw perfect world, you write all the TypeScript, and we can take care of for you all of the HTML and the CSS. Whenever you want to make a design change, you don't have to go into those things anymore. You can just go into this nice design view and say, hey, actually, I want to put, well, I don't want that rectangle. That's an ugly rectangle. I want to put maybe that label text up here, and automatically that label text is just moved over here. That's pretty exciting. So the next level of this is that, okay, so we've got a visual designer and it's really nice and easy to use. And I prefer it personally to writing code. But ultimately, as an engineer, I actually shouldn't be doing a lot of the UIs because I've got an awesome designer on my team who's already doing all these mockups. And so really what we wanted to go for isn't just an easy designer that you can use instead of HTML and CSS. What we actually want to do is go all the way from the design files all the way into code. So I'm going to show that really quick right now. I have a sketch file. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Sketch. It's a very popular design tool. We can import our sketch file directly into PageDraw. We also just released support for Figma. So you can use Figma as well if that's something that your designers like. So over here, I'm going to go in. I'm just going to click Import Sketch. I'm going to click on Basic, which is the name of that file over here. And just for reference, this is what it looks like in Sketch. And then this is what it looks like in PageDraw. And just like that, I can compile it using the CLI. I think actually it'll be automatic. So if I rename this component to be imported from Sketch, that was an unnecessarily long name for me to type. The imported from Sketch component should maybe automatically show up as I refresh my PageDraw sync. Let's see if that works. Yep, I got my imported from Sketch component. I get that HTML exactly like it was, like I would have had to write by hand before. And I can use this Angular component just like any other Angular component. So one of the things that's really important for us is that we're not locking you into using PageDraw all the time. So not only is this code human readable, if you ever want to say, oh, actually, I don't like PageDraw anymore, let me leave, we have these notions of escape hatches. So if you have something that you're not sure PageDraw knows how to handle correctly, you can go in and you can say, override code over here and just give us some HTML to put, some templates, some code, and we'll just drop that in directly. But even more powerfully than that, you can have components designed in PageDraw reference other Angular components not defined in PageDraw. So if you have a pre-existing component library, for example, or design language that you've been sharing, you can use those components as modules within PageDraw designs of entire pages. You can also use PageDraw to make those components and then reuse them and so on and so on and so on. This is really nice. You can even do really complicated things, which we've seen a couple of early beta testers do, where you take a design done in PageDraw as a component, you wrap it with another Angular component done outside PageDraw, where you're doing maybe some data fetching or something like that. And then you put that again inside another PageDraw component so you can reuse it in a larger page. This is because PageDraw doesn't take care of any of your data for you. This is really important to us, that we think fetching from a server, syncing local state, all of this stuff requires really custom logic. Custom logic that would be just inappropriate to try to do in a visual tool. I'm a big believer in code. I just don't want to write HTML and CSS personally. So what we do is we say very specifically that if you have custom logic, if you have data fetching logic, all that kind of stuff, you do those in components that are outside PageDraw. And then those components simply require PageDraw components and use them and then pass the data down. So that's PageDraw. That's the 2-second, 30-second demo. So here we've got a relatively static thing. But of course, this hello world over here is just an example of a single item that might be in my to-do list. I'd actually have some variable things. So the way that we do this is I bind the data on them. So I take this checkbox here, and I've got another wrapper around them that repeats. And then in the code sidebar, basically, I just go ahead and say, actually, this is a list, and it's coming from a variable named list. And then in my code, my root component that has the logic in it is called app. I have app.component.html. And so you see we pass in this list is bound to this tasks variable, and the tasks is just a list here. So in my live version of this app, I've got different content, which is coming from my data. So if I added another element to this list, let's say use page draw again, hit save, it'll add use page draw again there. And of course, this is data, but this is just arbitrary JavaScript. So that all could have been fetched from a server or local state or anything else kind of fancy and cool that you might want to do. Data binding is as simple as saying, let me go take this thing, mark it as dynamic, and then give it a data binding. So in this case, it'll be bound to text3. Yeah, that's pretty much page draw. There's also some other cool stuff. Like we have, if you go to pagedraw.io, integration with stackblitz. I know that stackblitz is really popular in the Angular community. We love them too. So here we've got an example of a sort of fake IDE environment. On the top here, we've got the real page draw. And then on the bottom, we've got stackblitz, even though typically we might use page draw with our local environment. So on the left here, we've got your code editor. In your real project, you'd have, Vim or Sublime or Atom or whatever you like to use. You can have this nice little environment where you've got a code editor, localhost environment, and page draw all together. Designers tend to like this a lot because it means that you can throw together something quickly and share it with the rest of your team, even if it's a prototype that's not working yet. But what we're really excited about is giving developers this power tool that can take the designs from the designers. After the designers are done, developers take those designs, set up the data bindings, and then never have to worry about the HTML and CSS again. So that's PageDraw. We're built for developers. We're, as of Monday, going to release our preview for Angular. We import from Figma and Sketch. And we're really excited to have people try it out. I think that's pretty much all I really wanted to say. Yeah. How about undertime, overtime? Yeah.
All right, so if we can have our speakers come back up, we'll do the Q&A portion here. Let's make sure everybody has a mic.
Maybe share.
You just share.
All right, we'll just share your mic. Cool. Sharing is caring. How do we?
You MC.
Do you want to?
All right, there was a question in the back there. Go ahead.
It will be released in Material 6.0 and currently is in beta. Yeah, you can also build a tree different way if you use the CDK version.
Suddenly you put a timeline. Thank you. Okay. Because it's a simply node-based tree. So what I'm saying is, with this, just the algorithm logic, you can, which is built on the node tree from the JSON, which can be applied for several different UI outputs, not only for the file tree kind of flat tree. It could be for the circular bubbles, or it could be anything that you can dig down, drill into data with a lazy load kind of thing. So would you guys would like to consider different different UIs that can be built on one single logic instead of having just one file tree?
You mean different UI for the tree, right?
Absolutely, yes. So the same UI which you showed in the vertically, that can be used for a timeline that will show the nodes up and down like a timeline. And then it can also be used as a circle with bubbles, which you can drill down with a lazy load. The same way you'd click on the plus. And then,
so for material tree,
so whatever a lot of the components available with the D3 that can be done with one single logic that you recently built.
Yeah, that's another way to visualize the tree structure. but in our material tree, we can't do that. And
I'm giving a suggestion.
okay. I think that's a good suggestion for our like future product.
All right, next question over here.
Yeah, so page draw, good to see. I guess one of the questions is there's a lot of code out there already, and kind of a similar question is that bidirectional thing. Someone goes in and starts modifying stuff. So what are you thinking about that, and what would it take to kind of take what's existing and turn it into something that page draw understood?
Yeah, great question. So this is one of the most important things, is for us to be able to integrate into any code base without having to rewrite anything or like start from scratch in page draw. So the way that we do this, I kind of alluded to, is if you think about your Angular app as a tree of components. So on any given page, you've got one root component, and then there's like a tree down of all the different ones it's transitively requiring.
A tree of components, you say?
Yes, of course. Sorry. Maybe it's a component graph. I don't know. Anyway, for any component in that tree, if it's a visual component, you can take it and make it in page draw instead. But all of the components around it can stay handwritten. So if you've got an existing app that has tons of handwritten code in it, you're perfectly good to use page draw to generate a new page on it or a new widget on it and mix and match the page draw generated components with the existing handwritten components. You don't need to bring in your existing handwritten components into page draw. You can just require them. So I actually didn't go into this in the demo, but page draw is all component based. So you can have a component over here and use that component over here inside a bigger component, and use that component inside another bigger component, and so forth, the same way you would normally in Angular. And those inner components that you're using in a bigger one can be written in code instead of done in page draw. I don't know if that answers the question.
I just want to see how it's
Oh,
done.
can I?
Let's see if there's other questions,
Okay.
and then we can come back to that. All right.
Hi, my name is Pratik, and I have two questions, one for David and one for the page draw app. So I'm new to Angular Firebase and Firestore. What happens when multiple clients, try to change remote state? How does is it handled on the server side completely, or?
So like conflict resolution. So if you have like contention over like one spot in your database, it's going to be like, you can set up security rules to do more advanced things, but it's going to be by default the last write that wins. But that tends to not be a problem, because the way that we kind of give you some tools to avoid conflict between your resources. So effectively, when you call an add method on a collection, it'll actually generate an ID. And so that way you won't just be using like sequential or named ones. And so the odds that there's going to be contention on that, item is, very low.
Okay, that's good. And the other question was for page draw. So can I specify views for different form factor?
Yes. So we have support both for Flexbox style constraints, as well as in a separate feature, media query style breakpoints. So you can specify, here's how the design looks on mobile, here's how the design looks on desktop, and we'll switch between them based on the screen size.
Okay.
And then within like mobile, for example, or within desktop separately, you can say, this thing will stick to the left corner, that thing will stick to the right corner, this thing will grow as the screen grows. And so you can do all the same responsive stuff you would with HTML and CSS.
Okay, thank you.
I think there was...
It's for the page draw. My name is Manali, and I'm new to Sketch. I'm a UX designer. So my question is, you showed that you can actually import a Sketch file into your page draw app, and it renders the component. But usually we as designers have seen that we have multiple artboards in a single page. So, and there are multiple pages in a single Sketch file. So is there a way to select a particular artboard to create the component?
Yeah, what we just do is say we import all of the pages automatically, and then you can select the artboards you want, and we've got a button that just deletes all the ones you don't want. Nice and straightforward.
Hey, I have a page draw question as well. many components, especially the complex ones, have different states.
Yeah.
What about that?
Can I do a demo? Cool. This is brought up for something else, but appropriate here too. So here is a component, like for example, a button. It's a little subtle here because the colors are washed out, but you've got a different color for the hover state and the active state. And so what we do is we just have a switch statement basically in code where we say, depending on the state that the button is in, we're going to render something different. And this isn't just limited to colors. I could have the button have like a little, I don't know, like a gray rectangle on hover. Don't know why you'd want to do that. I'm not a designer. Apologies. And so when you hover over this here, you can see that little gray rectangle shows up. And when I unhover, it doesn't. And then the active state, again, is something completely different. So hover is just one of the ways that we do multi-state. There's a lot of different things where multi-state comes up. Sometimes it might be an email that's read versus unread, or spam versus not spam, or other things like that. But multi-state is a super common primitive. And in fact, to the question over there about screen sizes, we actually do the same thing for screen sizes. So it's a multi-state for like a screen on the mobile version versus the same screen on desktop version is like 2 states of the same screen. There we go. We don't have support for animations yet. So what our answer is there is that anytime PageDraw doesn't support something, or you're not comfortable with PageDraw supporting it, we've got these escape hatches where you mark, here is the HTML code that I want to insert, and PageDraw will stop generating code for that rectangle, that sub-region of the screen. And you just give us whatever code you want there, and we'll drop that code into the generated code file. So you never have to edit the generated code, but you get all the benefits of just writing whatever you want. Yeah.
So this is for the tree. One of the things that was mentioned was that the flat version of the tree is easier to do virtual rendering with. Is that sort of built in and supported by the material library, or will it be?
Currently it's not supported because we haven't finished our virtual scrolling in CDK, and after that we will make sure it works with the tree.
And then slightly related, does the tree support like keyboard navigation around the tree and properly handles like, going up a directory or down?
No, it doesn't support the keyboard navigation because we want the user to implement the accessibility part, but we will make a simple tree that shows you how to do it, and we will add that keyboard navigation later.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh.
This is for PageDraw. So can I use PageDraw for existing HTML and CSS if I have to modify it?
What do you mean by existing HTML and CSS?
So already, if say the web app application is there, we have existing HTML and CSS file. Can I use PageDraw to modify it?
So we think that you should use PageDraw on a per component basis. So if you've got existing, excuse me, if you have an existing app, it's probably broken out into a bunch of different separate components that are all composed together. You can use PageDraw to do a single one of those components. We have to switch them over one by one. PageDraw is not meant to be a HTML editing tool. We think that there's a lot of like fundamental reasons why that doesn't quite work for us. And so instead what we want to do is let the source of truth live in the PageDraw doc, which is in the cloud. And then we can recompile every time for every edit you make to the PageDraw doc into the HTML and CSS or the Angular component, which we treat as generated code.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, we'll come back over here.
So NgRx and Fire, I'm forgetting the name. A lot of similarities there. From a development point of view, it seems like I almost want to make it even simpler to make them the same, which then leads to the question of like, why didn't I start storing more application state in the cloud? Any trade-offs or, I assume it's around performance, but any thoughts around what I should not be?
It's not, at that point, it's not really like performance based. It's just, I mean, depending on how much you're storing. If you're storing like, it depends on how ephemeral you want that local state to be. Like, if someone clicks like, button way down in a component tree and that needs to open something way up top in a component tree, it's really nice to use NgRx to say, hey, I'm dispatching that this event happens. And then that way it kind of bubbles up and then you just toggle that state. Now, if you store that in a database, it's it's going to be persistent. So when the user opens up, whatever was the last state in the menu might open, it might be closed. And so you effectively now have to worry about like clearing out your local state. So it's kind of like, if you've ever done unit tests against a database, it's kind of like that, where you have like your tear up, you run it, and then you have to like destroy your whole environment to make sure it's not going to muddy the next run of tests. And so like, it's, in some cases it is what you want. Like, if you have a left nav or something like that a user toggles in and out and it's some app they're in all the time, you might want to persist that, hey, this is open, this is closed, because they come back to it and they're like, I'm really sick and tired of shutting this thing all the time. Like that's the difference there, is like when it's more ephemeral, like you don't want your profile like bubble popping up all the time or just showing up on the page randomly. It's like when you see it, it should not be in the database. Oh yeah.
Other questions? Okay.
Yeah, this is a very subtle question, but in your demo, for deletion of the item, this is for the Firebase one, I saw that you're also passing the whole payload. So you're passing the ID of the item and also the payload. But for deletion, you just need the ID, right? Why do you?
Correct. In that case, that's a bit like, so for like, if you're adding an item, you're going to need to pass the whole item into the payload. That was like over, like, that was overkill in that case. But most of the time I end up following this practice that, like, instead of just passing in the ID, you just pass in the object, and then that way the API, it's the method's responsibility of like plucking out what it needs. But even in that case, you actually don't even need the payload, because that path will know the ID and just be able to delete it. And that was like one of the design decisions of having the path versus like making the payload be really responsible for everything.
All right, last chance for questions. Going once, going twice. All right, let's give all of our presenters another big round of applause. All right, I think the last announcements before we end the evening, I want to identify that our next meetup is April 25th on the Google campus here. It won't be in this building, it'll be in the other one that we often meet at. And that meetup will be a couple things. We'll be covering both doing demos of the new things in 6.0.0, as well as we will be having a few members of the CLI team come and present. So we're very excited to have them. And we actually even know the one after that. So the day before Google I/O, May 7th, I believe it is, we'll be having a social gathering. So not a presentation, but just come and meet the team, come and meet Angular GDEs who are in town for I/O. And so that will be starting at about 6 o'clock on May the 7th. So hope to see you all there. And thank you so much for coming. Good night.